So the first component of a nation's political economy that we're going to look at today is its political system, which not surprisingly is the system of government in that particular nation. Now typically when we talk about political systems, these are organised and assessed according to two key dimensions. The first is the degree to which the country emphasises collectivism as opposed to individualism, and secondly the degree to which the country is either democratic or totalitarian. We're going to look at each of these dimensions in turn over the next few slides. Alright, so collectivism, the first of these two, or one end of the first dimension that we're going to look at here, and it stresses the primacy of collective goals over individual goals, and can be traced back to the Greek philosopher Plato, not Pluto. We're talking about this dude here, Plato, way back hundreds of years ago. Now today when we talk about collectivism, it's typically associated with socialists, and one of the most famous of which is Karl Marx and his publication, The Communist Manifesto. He and other socialists typically advocate state ownership of the basic means of production, distribution and exchange. So generally suggested that government should be the ones who own the key businesses in a nation's economy. And these businesses should be managed by the government to benefit society as a whole rather than individual capitalists. So here and other socialists argued that it is in the best interest of society as a whole for the government to be making decisions, not necessarily to make the most money for key shareholders, but to best consider everyone's interests when those decisions are made. In the early 20th century, we saw socialism split into two different paths. The first of these paths is communism, and this is the idea that socialism is best or most commonly or potentially only achieved through violent revolution and potentially even totalitarian dictatorships. And we see examples of nation states here like the former USSR, China and even North Korea today is a good example of a communist state. Certainly by the mid-1990s though, communism was in significant decline. There aren't that many countries today who still would be classified as communist nations. Certainly North Korea would be one of those. If anyone has ever read the book or seen the movie of Animal Farm, you'll have a good idea, a good understanding of a practical sort of representation of what these key ideas behind communism represent and what that means for society as a whole. The other path that collectivism went down early in the 20th century was the social democratic path, and this is the idea that socialism is achieved best through democratic means, and we do still see a number of nations today who typify these ideals. France, Germany and India are all good examples here. Like communism, but perhaps not to the same extent, it has been retreating as more and more countries have moved towards a free market economy. And certainly we've seen a lot of state-owned enterprises, government-owned businesses being privatised, even in a lot of these social democratic nations like France and Germany. So overall, certainly collectivism as a political system has been in decline over the last few decades. The opposite of collectivism is individualism. And this represents the idea that an individual should have freedom in his or her economic and political pursuits. So certainly a lot of Western nations like the US, like Great Britain, represent individualist nations. Certainly if you have not yet had a look at Mark Jacko Jackson's magnificent song, I'm an Individual, Google it and thank me later. It could be the best thing you see today. Individualism as a political notion certainly can be traced to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, or is most commonly traced back to Aristotle. You can see a picture of him there up in the top of your screen now. Now he argued that individual diversity and private ownership are most desirable, that these are the sorts of principles that we should be advocating in a society. He argued that individual economic and political freedoms are the ground rules on which a society should be based, and certainly if we look in a country like Australia and most other Western nations, these are the sorts of ideals that we strive for today. He also asserted that the welfare of society is best served by allowing the pursuit of individual economic self-interest. That is, the idea that if we let businesses and individuals run their businesses as they want to, that is typically to make as much money as they can, we'll see improvements in things like efficiency and productivity, with businesses run to their greatest potential effectively, which typically leads to, at least in theory, an improvement in things like standards of living and and income per capita. Overall, we do see individualism implying that democratic political systems and free market economies, i.e. capitalism, are most desirable. And we're going to look at this dimension, certainly democratic political systems, on the next few slides. Alright, so democracy is the idea of government of the people, by the people, for the people, as explained by Abraham Lincoln. If you're not sure who Abraham Lincoln is, he is the 16th President of the United States of America, and little known fact, as you can see in the top right corner, also a massive St Kilda fan. Loves his Saints get up there, may not have ever seen a St Kilda match before, but surprisingly is a big fan, that's for sure. A political system, a democracy rather, is a political system in which the government is by the people, and now this can be either exercised in one of two ways, and it can be either direct or through elected representatives. Now obviously direct democracy involves the citizens themselves being involved in the decision making and the key decisions that occur within that particular country. Not typically too common today. On the other hand, what we do usually see when we talk about democracy is representative democracy, and this is where citizens elect individuals to represent them and make decisions on their behalf, which is how the US ended up in a situation where this man down the bottom of the screen, Donald Trump, is now the president. He was elected by the people to make decisions on their behalf. If we talk about the ideal state, or the ideal criteria rather, for a democratic state, there are a few key principles that we need to understand and acknowledge. First, and we hear a lot about the individual right for freedom of expression and organisation. Even sometimes if somebody perhaps shouldn't be given that freedom to express himself, or at least I suspect may regret some of their expressions. Free media is another thing that is commonly associated with democracy, the ability to media to not be controlled by the government and to be able to effectively print or express themselves without fear of being punished or controlled. Universal adult suffrage and regular elections, that is the ability and right to vote, and also regular elections to determine who is going to be the governing party at that particular time. Limited terms for elected representatives, which is why we see, for example, Obama dropping the mic and walking out, because the United States, as a democratic nation, has a policy where you can only be president for a certain number of terms, which is why, despite his popularity, Obama did have to drop the mic and walk out. And finally, fair and independent court systems and are another key cornerstone of democracy today when we talk about court and legal systems not being burdened and controlled again by the governing party. Totalitarianism is the opposite of democracy, and this is a form of government in which one person or political party exercises absolute control over all spheres of human life and prohibits opposing political parties or individuals. Now, there are a few different types of totalitarianism that we can see, and by far the most common today is communist totalitarianism. Now, while we did acknowledge before that communism overall has been in decline for the last few decades, we do still see examples today of this. Certainly, our very cheery friend here, Kim Jong-un from North Korea, is the leader of a communist totalitarian party in his country. Theocratic totalitarianism is where the political power is monopolized by a party group or individual that governs based on religious principles. So we see a lot of Middle Eastern countries who adopt this type. Saudi Arabia, for example, where the governing party is typically controlling or the rules and laws are established based around religious principles. Tribal totalitarianism is where a political party represents the interests of a particular tribe and usually gains power. Some African nations we still see examples of tribal totalitarianism in place today. And there's also right-wing totalitarianism, which permits some level of economic freedom, but generally restricts individual political freedom. So Nazi Germany was a good example of that here. Certainly in Hitler's time, when he was in power, if you were able to make money for Germany, absolutely go for it. But if you wanted to oppose Hitler and his party, you were not given the freedom to do so, that's for sure. So that's a good example of right-wing totalitarianism.